In today's session, I'll be finishing up my discussion of the American Civil War, focusing on some of the key battles and turning points, and finishing with a discussion of the immediate aftermath, including the final demise of slavery. Just to kind of remind ourselves what's going on here in terms of the key players in the war, we've got the Union Army, of course, representing the United States, and the Confederate Army representing, of course, the southern states which have seceded from the Union. And of course, as a reminder, several of the southern slave-owning states, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, are all still part of the Union. And that'll be an important factor to remember as we get into things like the Emancipation Proclamation and Lincoln's overall strategy for the war. He has to keep in mind that the United States is still currently made up of both free and slave states. We talk about the battle, the actual fighting that takes place during the war. It takes place in four basic theaters of operation, as they say in military jargon. Four basic areas of the country where fighting is going to take place. First and foremost, most of the fighting is going to take place in the Eastern Theater, which is centered around Virginia. And of course, this is no big surprise. Virginia, this region around Virginia, contains both of the capitals of the United States and the Confederate States. Most of the intense fighting will take place in this theater. This is, of course, the biggest centers of population, and of course, both of the centers of government. General Robert E. Lee leading the armies of the Confederacy, and General Ulysses S. Grant leading the armies of the United States. These will be two of the key players in this Virginia or this Eastern Theater. Both of these generals will fight in other places during the war, but their primary area of focus, especially during the last half of the war, is going to be in this Eastern Theater. And of course, take a look at the map here for these other theaters. Of course, let me back up for a second. This is, of course, General Ulysses S. Grant and General Robert E. Lee. These are the two primary military commanders during the Civil War, representing the United States. Grant representing the United States, and Lee, of course, representing the Confederate States. And both of these, what's ironic, and this is true across most levels of command during this Civil War. These two generals had been friends and professional colleagues prior to the war. Both had attended West Point, both knew each other well. They fought together in the Mexican War. And we're in a situation now where these two generals must face off against each other. Former colleagues, brothers in arms, so to speak, now facing off against each other on opposite sides of the battlefield. And this is true in numerous engagements throughout the Civil War. We saw men who had, or military leaders who had previously fought together in previous wars, or had been classmates at West Point, fighting now against each other. And this partially accounts for the intensity of some of these battles. Neither side has a real advantage in terms of military leadership, because both sides benefit from these West Point trained generals and subordinate commanders. And another issue is that they know how each other thinks. Grant knows how Lee thinks. Lee knows all of Grant's strategies because they've worked together for so many years. Their careers overlap, so extensively. Each one knows how the other one thinks, so it's easier to anticipate the actions of your opponent in a situation like this, and of course much harder, much more difficult to come up with something that they haven't already thought of. So one of the reasons these battles will rage very intensely, in some cases producing massive casualties, is because neither side has a real leadership advantage. Both sides benefit from such good leaders. Getting back to our theaters of war, here again, looking at this map, you can see most of the major battles taking place here in this Eastern Theater, centered around the Virginia area. And of course, we've got both capitals, United States capital, Washington, D.C., and once the war really begins, the Confederacy moves their capital to Richmond, Virginia. So we have both capital cities here in relative close proximity to each other, and for that matter, for that reason, a lot of the most intense fighting takes place in this area, as you can see with this battle map here. Western Theater refers to fighting going on in and around the state of Tennessee. In fact, some of the major battles of Fort Donelson, of course, which was kind of a prelude to a battle of Nashville, and of course Shiloh, Chattanooga, and all these areas are part of the Western Theater. The Mississippi River is another key point of contention during this war. Whoever controls the Mississippi River is obviously going to have a great advantage here, and some intense fighting will take place, especially around the city of Vicksburg in Mississippi, where a Union victory there will finally give the United States total control of the Mississippi River, cutting the South in half. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. And of course, our final theater is the Union blockade of Confederate ports. And of course, the United States has a navy at the beginning of the war. The Confederacy has no official navy. As the war drags on, the Confederacy does manage to produce a few small warships that they use to try and run, they call them blockade runners, in terms of trying to gain access to the seas through this Union blockade. So there are a few small naval engagements, but it's not a major component of the war, naval battles. The blockade, of course, is a key part of the Union strategy, but large naval battles will not really be a part of this, other than very few exceptions. And of course, so those are our major theaters of the war. And again, we see just from looking at the map at first glance, we see that most of the fighting is going to take place here in the east, this Eastern Theater centered around Virginia. And we'll talk about some of these key battles here in a minute. So you should not think of this list as all-inclusive. This list of important battles and campaigns, there were many, many important battles and many, many more that were of lesser strategic importance. Now, I haven't selected these particular battles just arbitrarily or randomly. I chose these particular battles to discuss because these represent either a significant turning point in the war or a campaign, or they were of particular strategic value in terms of their geographic location. But again, it's important to remember that there are many important battles in the war, and this is but a small sampling of them. You can make a whole career out of studying Civil War battles and spend the rest of your life studying this and still not study it completely. At any rate, so we're just going to choose a few battles here that kind of represent some of the major turning points. And first of all, I'll draw your attention to this Battle of New Orleans here as a Union victory in 1862. Keep in mind, this is more than a year into the war. And it's not that there haven't been any significant battles up to this point. In fact, up to this point, a lot of the victories have gone to the Confederacy. And if you remember in our last session, I pointed out how in a short war, or early in a war, in this war, the Confederacy's advantages, their qualitative advantages, would come into play almost immediately, whereas the Union's quantitative advantages wouldn't really be a factor until later on in a longer war. So for that reason, during the first year of the war, the Confederacy actually did quite well. Several key battles. In fact, the first major battle, the Battle of Bull Run in 1861, was largely considered a Confederate victory, mainly because they were so prepared for this battle, and of course the Union Army was very ill prepared at this point. They had not really gotten organized. But by the time we finished the first year of the war, the Union has got itself organized, and some of their advantages are starting to come into play at this point. Battle of New Orleans is significant because it gives the United States now control of the port of New Orleans, which is one of the most important ports in the South. This is where a lot of trade goods are imported and cotton is exported from these ports here. Plus, it's the mouth of the Mississippi River, so it's an important. The Mississippi River is an important artery in this, in terms of geography and transportation. So this is important because it gives the Union control of the lower Mississippi River. The Battle of Antietam is considered by history to be an indecisive battle. Technically, nobody really won this battle at Antietam, but it's important for several other reasons. Not necessarily because it was indecisive, but it's some of the statistics here make it significant. Antietam was the single bloodiest day in the entire Civil War. In one day's worth of fight, of course, the battle only lasts about a day, just a little bit more than a day. In this battle, in this one single day worth of fighting, there were over 22,000 casualties, and that's combined. That's killed and wounded on both sides. So 22,000 men are going to be killed or wounded in a single day of fighting during the Civil War. So that makes the Battle of Antietam the bloodiest single day in the Civil War. Why was it so bloody? When we look at the map here, Antietam Creek is a small creek in western Maryland, and there was, of course, the battle takes place here. Basically, the Southern armies are trying to invade a little bit into Northern Territory here. An opportunity presented itself, and Confederate forces attempt to push into Union territory. In order to do that, they need to cross this bridge at Antietam Creek. Whenever you're talking about moving armies, all transportation of troops is over land here. Troops march, horse-drawn wagons and cannons. So we need bridges in order to cross rivers. It's almost impossible to move troops over land without access to these bridges. So these bridges, along even small bridges across minor tributaries and creeks, become important locations for strategic targets. And this bridge over Antietam Creek in Maryland is one of those targets. Confederacy trying to push into Union territory across this Antietam Creek, and of course Union armies stopping them. The battle only takes place over the course of about a day, but again we see heavy losses on both sides. And one of the reasons it's considered indecisive is because there was no surrender here. The Confederate Army will, after about a day or so, will withdraw from this battle, and they don't ever surrender. They just withdraw from the battle. Basically, at this point, Lee sees this battle as going nowhere. It's unproductive. If we were going to achieve anything here, we would have achieved it by now. It's pointless to keep wasting men when there's no clear end in sight. So Lee and the Confederates decide to withdraw from this battle and regroup. And so there was no surrender, and this is one of the reasons it's considered decided. Nobody gained any territory here. Nothing happened. Basically after the battle, both sides are in the same relative position that they were before the battle. So again, that's one of the reasons we consider it indecisive. However, Abraham Lincoln will consider this a victory, and this is how he's going to present it to the American public as a first significant victory, turning point, if you will, is how he's going to advertise it in the war, and he's going to use that to justify issuing his Emancipation Proclamation, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. After this battle, Lincoln's strategy was this exhaustion and annihilation. Keep the pressure on the South at all times. And when the Union General McClellan, at the end of the battle, he fails to pursue the Confederates as they withdraw. And Lincoln actually goes out to Maryland. Here's a photograph of Lincoln meeting with McClellan. He goes out to Maryland and he confronts McClellan. Why did you not pursue the Confederates as they withdrew? This is our chance to destroy Lee's army, and you failed to take it. McClellan, of course, trying to explain to the president that we're in bad shape. We took a severe beating in this battle. 22,000 men dead. The Confederates are in bad shape, and Lincoln's like, that's why they would have been easy to go down and get them. They're in bad shape. They took a beating. They'd be easy to catch. McClellan tells Lincoln, well, we're in just as bad a shape as they are. We're in no position to pursue anybody. So Lincoln is very disappointed that McClellan here has hesitated to seize the initiative. And again, this was Lincoln's big strategy. He wanted his generals to really press the attack against the Confederates, to seize every opportunity to destroy them. And McClellan here has not demonstrated this. So Lincoln fires McClellan and looks for another general to take control of the Union forces. So the big thing we want to remember about this Battle of Antietam is that Lincoln uses it. Lincoln calls it a victory, even though technically neither side achieved anything what we call a true victory here. Lincoln is gonna tell the American people, we have achieved a victory at the Battle of Antietam. Union forces were victorious over the Confederate forces. They withdrew. We forced them to retreat. This is a Union victory. Lincoln uses this as an example of how the war is going our way. I told you that I would deliver victory, and here we're producing that on the battlefield. The war is going in favor of the Union, and Lincoln uses this as an opportunity to rationalize expanding the aims of the war, to not only include preserving the Union, but he adds now to it slavery as one of the key issues in the war. So he issues the Emancipation Proclamation after the Battle of Antietam, using the battle as kind of a justification for starting to push against slavery. Now he still has to be very careful here. He can't announce that we're going to destroy slavery as a whole, because keep in mind, several slave states, Missouri, Kentucky, and Maryland and Delaware, all of these slave states are still part of the Union. So Lincoln cannot launch an all-out assault on the institution of slavery without risking the loss of these 4 important states. Especially Maryland and Kentucky are both vital to the Union because they give the Union a geographic advantage. So Lincoln, when he issues his Emancipation Proclamation, he will free the slaves only in the states of the Confederacy. And he's very specific and he's very clear in his proclamation that only the slaves in those states which are part of the Confederacy are going to be freed. As the slaves in Missouri and Kentucky and Maryland and Delaware, he's not touching those slaves, only the ones in the Confederacy. And Lincoln wants to, personally, he wants to see the end of slavery. Politically and strategically, he cannot basically declare war on slavery here because he needs these border states to stay loyal to the Union. So he uses the Emancipation Proclamation to try to undermine the economy of the Confederacy. That's why he focused only on the Confederacy. And even as he issues this proclamation, he comes right out and says that he's not trying to get rid of slavery. He's trying to undermine the economy of the Confederacy. He figures if he frees all the slaves in the Confederacy, then there won't be anyone doing any work down there producing food and supplies and so on and so forth, and that will hinder the Confederacy's war effort. Not only that, is that these massive groups of newly freed slaves working their way north, Lincoln sees this as a possible source of extra troops. And it's after the Emancipation Proclamation that we see active recruiting of black soldiers to serve in the Union Army. In segregated regiments, of course, but still these newly freed slaves serve as kind of a source of additional troops. So Lincoln makes it clear that this Emancipation Proclamation is not an attempt to free all slaves. It is just an attempt to undermine the war effort of the Confederacy. And that's why he focuses it only on those Confederate states. Again, he does not free all the slaves, just the slaves in the Confederacy. Getting back to our list of key battles here. Battle of Vicksburg. Vicksburg is, of course, in Mississippi, right on the Mississippi River. And it's after this battle, it's a long battle, it lasts about several months, almost a year or so, this siege of Vicksburg. Once the Union achieves control of Vicksburg, it now has control of the entire Mississippi River. And of course, that is an important element of the Union strategy to divide the South. With the control of Vicksburg, of course, the South now is divided. And of course, it prevents Southern or armies from receiving reinforcements from places like Texas and so forth. So Vicksburg is important in that it gives Union control of the entire Mississippi River. Our Battle of Gettysburg is probably our next, probably the most significant battle on this list. And if you wanted to go so far as to say it's the most significant battle in the entire war, because it is a major turning point. And I can't emphasize this enough. This is a significant turning point. And when we say turning point here, it's after the Battle of Gettysburg that the South's ability to wage war becomes continually weakened after this battle. And we looked at the map or chart earlier in the last session. We're talking about manpower advantages, and the Battle of Gettysburg really highlights the North's manpower advantage, especially in the months and years right after Gettysburg, where the South is no longer able to replace its losses on the battlefield. So essentially, after the Battle of Gettysburg, all the troops that were lost at Gettysburg, the South won't be able to replace any of those troops. And every subsequent battle after Gettysburg, the Confederate Army will get smaller and smaller and smaller as a result of their casualties. They're never able to replace those men. Whereas the Union Army, after Gettysburg, will continue to grow larger and larger and larger. They'll not only replace their losses at Gettysburg, but they will recruit additional men, increasing the size of the Union Army. And by the time we get to the end of the war, the Union Army has close to 1 million men in uniform. Now, of course, not all those men are on the front line battlefields. Some of those men are new recruits. Some of them are recovering in field hospitals, but we're talking total number of Union Army. So again, Gettysburg is this turning point. Gettysburg was significant in further reasons too. Looking at our map here, Gettysburg was the first significant attempt of the Confederacy to invade the North. In fact, after this, the Confederacy won't make any more attempts to really invade the North. It's in Pennsylvania, so it represents a significant penetration into Northern territory by a Confederate army. And it was just kind of a random chance, an opportunity presented itself, and General Lee decided to take advantage of this opportunity and figured if he could push into the North and just cause enough destruction and disruption of Union activities, it would scare Northerners into withdrawing their support from this war and put pressure on Lincoln to bring an end to it. It didn't quite work out like Lee had planned. Looking at a closer map here, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, there was some small railroad junction there, so it had some strategic value. As you can see here, a single rail line comes through Gettysburg, and of course Lee is assuming that if he can seize this railroad line, then he can that will give him railroad access to the surrounding areas, and he'll be able to bring in more troops and spread those troops out even further. But unfortunately for Lee, he's intercepted by Union Army, and Gettysburg is as far as he makes it. So both sides will suffer horrific losses here at the Battle of Gettysburg. We'll see, about 25,000 or 23,000 Northern casualties, about 28,000 casualties on the Confederacy. So we're looking at well over 50,000 men will be injured or killed, wounded or killed at Gettysburg, and that's combined. That's both sides combined. So again, Gettysburg, while Antietam was the single bloodiest day in the Civil War, Gettysburg is the bloodiest battle because there'll be more casualties at Gettysburg than any other battle. And of course, Gettysburg lasted several days longer than Antietam. So at any rate, Gettysburg is important for a couple different reasons, but mainly because it's a major turning point. Of course, here's an artist's illustration of the Battle of Gettysburg, and you can see so many thousands of troops facing off against each other. It's a very chaotic battle, and of course you can imagine the high casualties for reasons we talked about before: rifled weapons, advanced artillery, and of course as the battle unfolded, the Union Army was able to take control of the higher ground, which forced the Confederate to attack from a position of disadvantage. Again, a lot of things stacked up against the Confederacy here. That and the fact that their supply lines were stretched so thin, they simply were unable to win this battle. Of course, here we're looking at a photograph of the aftermath of the Battle of Gettysburg. And here again, we see the power of photography really bringing home these stark images of what war looks like, or at least the aftermath. And again, this shot across the one of the battlefields at Gettysburg, and we see the field is literally covered with dead and wounded soldiers. And again, pictures like this showing up in the newspaper really have an impact on American public and both sides, not just the Union but the Confederacy as well. And people, for the first time, are starting to get a better idea of the cost of war. The cost is very real. It's not just something you read about in the newspaper. Okay, this side won, this side lost. It's not as simple as winning and losing because men on both sides will pay with their lives. So American people and of course the world too, gets a better idea of what war looks like as a result of these images. Here we're looking at Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, and of course this is another reason, another thing that makes the Battle of Gettysburg so significant. Lincoln here traveling out to the battlefield and using this Battle of Gettysburg as an opportunity to point out to America, not just the Union, but all of Americans, the cost of war. And Lincoln here, of course, we're not going to recite his whole address, but he makes several points very clear in this address that we can't forget the sacrifice that the soldiers here on both sides have made for this sake of the Civil War, this idea of preserving the Union. In fact, he uses this as a further rationale for his mission of preserving the Union. We must preserve this Union so that these men, and of course to quote Lincoln, who've given the last full measure of devotion will not have died in vain. Men here on both sides who have sacrificed their lives for this cause. If we don't preserve the Union, then all these tens of thousands of men will have died in vain. So Lincoln's Gettysburg Address is aimed at all Americans, not just as a Union victory speech here, but it's aimed at trying to draw everyone's attention to the cost of war, and because it costs so high, we must not forget that, and really try to preserve the Union for the sake of those who've given their lives for this cause. So again, here this photograph of the Gettysburg Address. It's quite chaotic. If you look at some other artist portrayals of this speech, it's a little bit more organized and traditional. Lincoln standing at a podium on a stage, and an orderly crowd gathered to listen. Here, of course, this photograph is anything but orderly. It's chaotic. It's a mess. We're not even sure which of these figures in the middle is Abraham Lincoln. Most historians who have studied this event and the official record and this photograph agree that this man here in the middle is probably Abraham Lincoln. But this is not quite what you would imagine. When you think of a big important speech of historical significance, you usually think of something, an event that's a little bit more organized. Here, this is it's a kind of a wild mob. But this was the aftermath of Gettysburg. It drew a lot of attention. People came here from all around the surrounding area, and of course Lincoln and his staff from Washington specifically to deliver this address. Getting back to our list here, Battle of Chattanooga in November that same year. Of course, you see a lot going on in 1863 there. Union making quite a few gains there in 1863. Battle of Chattanooga is important mainly because it is a major railroad junction. And when we talk about the importance of railroads in the war, we've already done that. We're not going to go back over that same material. But Chattanooga is a major railroad junction. It's in Tennessee. It's essentially, Chattanooga is the gateway into Atlanta. There's a major rail line that goes from Chattanooga directly into Atlanta. And of course, Atlanta is a major target. It's one of the major cities of the South. The Union Army wants to seize control of Atlanta. And in order to do that, they're going to have to take control of Chattanooga. Looking at a closer scale here, this is a map of Chattanooga from the Civil War. We can see here several railroad lines coming into Chattanooga. branching out east and west, and of course one line heading off to the south toward Atlanta. So whoever controls, plus is a major river here, the Tennessee River, also used for transportation as well. Whoever controls Chattanooga is going to have access or control of these railroad lines, and of course the river. And Chattanooga was one of the few places in the South where that contained a major railroad service and repair facilities. So that's important too. When you want to talk about repairing and maintaining railroad equipment, it has to be done in order to use that equipment for the war. Chattanooga was one of the few places in the South that had these type of facilities. So it was also important for both sides to want to control this territory. So Chattanooga is important for its geographical or strategic value. In terms of its the size of the battle, it wasn't any more or less intense than any other important battle in the Civil War, but it's important mainly because of its strategic location. In the fall of '64, and this, by the time we get to the fall of '64, we're really looking at the beginning of the end. The Union attack at Atlanta, in the fall of '64, Union armies laid siege to Atlanta for several weeks. Atlanta, keep in mind, even in 1864 was a very large city, and of course, as such, it's important. Also, another major railroad junction in Atlanta. So, it's an important. It has strategic value. The Union Army wants to control it. The Southern Army wants to maintain control of it. So, both sides fighting very intensely over this city of Atlanta. Now, at this point where the Union Army kind of turns a corner in terms of their strategy. The war has been dragging on for almost 4 years now, and a lot of public pressure on the Lincoln administration to bring about a swift end to this war. Voters in the North, okay, you told us this war was going to be over quickly, and we're still fighting it 4 years later. And after the Battle of Gettysburg, too, Lincoln thought the war was getting ready to come to an end. We're past this point now, where victory is in sight, and of course here we are, more than a year later, and we're still fighting, and voters are getting kind of anxious with Lincoln administration in terms of bringing an end to this war. And it's at this point too that Lincoln has finally tapped his ideal general. Lincoln has gone through several key generals. Of course, when he fired McClellan, it was just the first of several generals that Lincoln would fire as his supreme Union commander. After the Battle of Vicksburg, Lincoln had tapped Ulysses S. Grant. Grant was in charge of this siege of Vicksburg, and Lincoln was impressed with his performance, so he taps Grant to serve as the supreme commander of Union forces. And he gives Grant explicit instructions. I want victory. You need to finish this war. You need to finish this Civil War so we can get on with the business of rebuilding the country. Grant tells Lincoln, he's like, okay, sir, I can get that done. I can do that. I can accomplish what you want, but it's not going to be cheap, and it's not going to be easy. And I can give you victory. Lincoln's like, fine, just get it done. Just make it happen. So Grant here starts to think outside of the box. As it turns out, Major General William T. Sherman was in charge of Union forces at Atlanta, and Grant sends word to Sherman. He's like, okay, you fooling around long enough at Atlanta. You need to just finish the job there and move on. And he's like, well, it's going to take time to take the city. It's like, don't take the city. Just destroy it and move on. And Sherman's like, no problem. So it's here, beginning with this battle at Atlanta, we see the Union strategy turn into what we call total war. There's no target that is off limits. Everything is fair game. Civilians, towns, farms, all become targets of opportunity in this total war. It's not just a war against one army against another. It's a war against an entire group of people. So we've turned a corner here, and this Battle of Atlanta is kind of the beginning of that. And we see here on the map here, Atlanta in 1864, a Union victory, mainly because General Sherman literally burns the city to the ground. He sends word and he sends a messenger into Atlanta with a message for the Confederate forces. He's like, everybody who wants to live needs to get out of Atlanta right now because I'm getting ready to burn this place to the ground. And and he does. He burns the entire city to the ground, and then he starts a destructive a rampage, more or less, across the state of Georgia to Savannah, and then he turns north and heads through the Carolinas, doing the same thing. Looking at another map here, closer zoom in map, we see, of course, they call it Sherman's March to the Sea. It's an infamous battle. Basically, the Union Army now is no longer concerned with taking and controlling these cities. They are concerned only now with destroying them. So you don't need to leave behind a bunch of troops to guard the city that you just conquered. You don't have to leave long supply lines. Basically what Sherman does is he stretches his army out. Okay, everybody stretch out, double arm interval, and they just march across Atlanta. And you're looking at this, it's about a 50-mile wide path of destruction that he leaves across the state of Georgia. They just destroy everything in their path. And as far as we don't need resupplies, we'll just take what we want or what we need, livestock or food or whatever supplies we need, we'll just take that from the local people. So this becomes, again, it's what we call a total war. You might even call this an 1860s weapon of mass destruction, because that's essentially what's happening here. Sherman is just destroying everything in his path, and he's leaving behind just a wake of scorched earth, as they call it in modern terms. And of course, he does the same thing once he gets to the coast. He turns north and he does the same thing through the Carolinas. They call it Sherman's March to the Sea because, of course, this is where it began, from Atlanta to Savannah on the Atlantic coast here. But the destruction that he left actually was more intense through the Carolinas than it was through Georgia. Looking at how some of this plays out here. Here, of course, is William Sherman. I don't know if he was just trying to pose for this picture and put on a scary face, or was this his indicative of his regular disposition. But in any case, if you were living in Georgia or the Carolinas during the Civil War, you did not want to be in the path of William Sherman, because his new orders basically were to just a scorched earth campaign. If you were in his path, you were going to either be dead or homeless, left with nothing. So again, this is a different type of strategy. It kind of indicates Lincoln's frustration with how long the war has lasted, basically turning things over to Grant, and Grant saying, okay, I can get the job done, but it's not going to be pretty. And of course, he delivers. He delivers swift victory. The war will end within the next 6 months or so. But it's largely the result of this scorched earth campaign that really brings the South to its knees. Here, of course, an artist depiction of Sherman with Atlanta burning in the background. And again, we're just looking at, this is a new type of fighting. We're not trying to seize control of territory for strategic purposes. We're just destroying a city and then moving on to the next city and destroying it and everything in our path. Here, of course, is an illustration of Sherman's campaign through Georgia and the Carolinas. And this, I like this illustration because it's kind of a composite of all the things that Sherman's army was doing in the South during this final campaign of the war. We see, of course, Union soldiers tearing up railroad tracks. They're not using the railroad tracks to ship troops, because they're taking what they need. They don't need resupply. They're taking the supplies they need from the people. Here, of course, we see them gathering up stuff and so forth. Tearing down telegraph lines, tearing up railroad tracks, burning farms and homesteads. And here in the background, we see more things on fire, bridges and other buildings on fire. They're rounding up livestock. Again, they don't need to be resupplied. They just take whatever food they need from the Confederate townspeople. And another kind of a byproduct of this, marching in the distance behind Sherman's army, and this is pretty much through the whole time that they're marching through the South, a massive amounts of slave refugees are marching behind Sherman's army. Of course, these plantations are all destroyed. The slaves are now left. Okay, we're now homeless. We nothing. Where we go? We're supposed to be free now, but but our homes on this plantation have just been burned. We had nothing. There's a massive number of slave refugees now left in Sherman's wake as well. So I like this image because it is a composite of all the things that Sherman was doing in the South. This is just basically destroying as much as possible. They're not trying to take control of territory or control strategic locations. They're just trying to destroy things. And it's this type of fighting that really demoralizes the South. Of course, Southern armies are helpless to really do anything against this. Most of the Southern armies are spread out, defending other places, and again, Southern armies simply do not have the manpower to stand against Sherman's onslaught. And what ends up happening is, as a result of this type of fighting, a lot of Southern soldiers begin to desert their units and go back home to rescue their families. A soldier serving in Virginia or out in Tennessee, you'll get a letter from his family back home in Atlanta or South Carolina or someplace, and the letter reads, "Dear husband, we're proud of you for serving our cause and all, but Union Army just came through this area and they destroyed everything. They took all of our livestock, they burned our house, they burned our barn, they burned all our crops. We have nothing. Me and the kids are living in a tent on the outskirts of town, and we're not sure where our next meal is coming from." So the soldier reads this, and his morale goes straight through the floor. And this happens to a lot of Confederate soldiers, especially those who have been fighting for a cause that they themselves didn't really benefit from. We talked about, we posed this question earlier on. Why would the vast majority of Southern whites who did not own slaves, what would attract them to fight for this institution that they don't themselves benefit from? And we talked about how the Southern governments packaged this fight as a fight for their rights, a fight for the right to private property, the right of the states to decide for themselves what they wanted to do. And as they told these soldiers when they recruited them, the Southern politicians, all of whom were large plantation owners, they didn't come out and tell you, okay, you poor Southern whites who are going to be fighting this war, you're fighting to defend our institution of slavery so that we can maintain our position as wealthy elites in society. If they had presented it to them like that, no Southerners would ever have joined the Confederate Army. But when they tell them, okay, if we stay part of the Union, the federal government is going to strip you of your rights. They're going to take away not only our state's rights, but our individual rights to private property. And of course, these small white farmers, they don't want to lose their rights. Who would want to give up their rights? If my rights are being threatened, then yes, I will fight to protect that. So there's a little bit of manipulation that had taken place here. Of course, once these men have all volunteered and they've been fighting for several years for a cause that they think we're fighting to protect our rights, our way of life, and so on and so forth. Once it becomes clear that they are the ones who are paying the biggest price in this war. A lot of the farms that are being burned are not necessarily the big plantations. When Sherman marches through the South, he just makes a beeline for the coast and he destroys everything in his path. A lot of these farms that are getting destroyed are small family farms, and a lot of people who are suffering the most here are not the ones who have been in charge of this the South. So it's at this point where a lot of these Southerners are beginning to question their reason for fighting. What am I really fighting for? I'm fighting to protect my rights and to protect my family, yet my family is the ones who are suffering the most from this as a result of this war. And it's difficult for the average person to choose a cause over their family. As dedicated as some of these men were to their cause, a lot of them find themselves choosing, okay, I'm loyal to the South, I'm loyal to my home state, but my wife and children are suffering now, and I've got to go back home and take care of them. So we see that as a result of this scorched earth campaign that Sherman launches through the South, we'll see a lot of Confederate soldiers begin deserting and going back home to their families to try and rescue or salvage what's left of their lives. And this, along with Southern losses on the battlefield, really starts to shrink the Southern Army. And it's at this point we see that Southern armies are becoming less and less effective on the battlefield after this time period. Here, of course, is a picture. This is, I think, is in Columbia, South Carolina. We see it looks like, well, there's nothing has been left. There's a few foundations and some exterior walls left of some buildings, but most every building has been destroyed or gutted by fire. Even the stone buildings still are framed with wood, so a lot of stone foundations and walls will be left standing, but the interior of these buildings is completely gutted. And we'll see that this is just one of several southern cities that were left like this. Here, another picture of, I think this is also in South Carolina. Again, we see this massive destruction. This town is unusable anymore. To rebuild this town, they'll have to come in and tear everything out and just start from scratch. So this, again, is kind of the beginning of the end, right? This Sherman's March to the Sea, this scorched earth campaign really brings the South to its knees. And when you add on top of that the economic troubles that they kind of brought on themselves with their massive inflation, and of course just the fact that they've not been able to stop the Northern armies from invading, the South is in a situation where they are beginning to realize, and at the top, Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee and some of the other important Southern leaders are starting to realize now that the likelihood of them achieving their goal is almost zero. There's really no chance of them succeeding at this point, and they're just kind of waiting for the end. And the end comes almost to the day 4 years after the war began. The war begins in April of '61, and it will end in April of '65. Of course, in April 3rd of '65, Ulysses S. Grant and his armies lay siege to the city of Richmond, which is, of course, the Confederate capital, and that ends in much the same way that we saw the siege of Atlanta. Here, Richmond, of course, is the Confederate capital. The siege of Richmond actually began with the siege of Petersburg, which is kind of a suburb of Richmond. And this lasted for a few weeks or so. They destroyed the city of Petersburg, and then of course Richmond will be burned to the ground in much the same way that Atlanta was. Here we see this, the artist's portrayal of the city of Richmond, the Confederate capital, now in flames. And we'll look at a couple of photographs here too. Here, a wide-angle shot of Richmond, and we see it looks just like Atlanta and Columbia, South Carolina. The entire city burned to the ground, just a few foundations left. And when we zoom in, here is Main Street in downtown Richmond, the center of the Confederate government, and we see there's really nothing left. A few people standing here in these piles of rubble. And when we think about the scale of destruction, when you look at this picture, and this is in the spring of 1865. There's not a lot here to distinguish this from images that we see after World War II. When we look at places in Germany and France that have been completely destroyed by the fighting. So again, the level of destruction that we see in the Civil War has never been seen in wars prior to this. Even when cities were destroyed in the past, the destruction was never as complete and as absolute as it was in the Civil War. And again, this is due in large part to the new strategies and, of course, new weapons, more powerful artillery, and so on and so forth. They could lay siege to a city like this from outside of town and never actually set foot in Richmond to destroy it. So again, we see different type of warfare here. This total war, weapon of mass destruction, so to speak. So after Richmond falls, Robert E. Lee, the supreme commander of the Confederate forces, he realized Lee is not an idiot. In fact, Lee is often credited with being a military genius. And in fact, to a large extent, the fact that the South held on as long as they did can largely be attributed to Lee's tactics. But here in this case, Lee knows that it's over. Once Richmond falls, he knows there's no chance that they're ever going to win, and there's no sense in wasting more men fighting in this war that is obviously going to end in their destruction. So Lee indicates his intent to surrender in April of 65, not long, just barely a week after Richmond falls, and we see this surrender takes place in a place called Appomattox, Virginia. It's maybe about 50 miles or so outside of Richmond, and on a small farm, on the outskirts of Appomattox. This is where the actual surrender will take place. And of course, Lee knows that his army is incapable of defeating the North at this point, and there's nothing to be gained by sacrificing more men in this cause. Now there are some Confederate generals and some Confederate political leaders who argue that the South should keep fighting. We fight on to the last man. Every man, woman, and child will fight, and we'll fight to the death to preserve our way of life. Lee knows that there's really nothing to be gained by this. He's a smart man. He knows that, okay, yeah, we fought a good fight. We did our best, and that just wasn't good enough. We're simply not able to defeat the North in a way that we thought was practical. And it serves no purpose to sacrifice more people in a cause that is already lost. So here an artist's portrayal of General Lee signing the terms of surrender in front of Ulysses S. Grant and his staff. Of course, they brought all their staffs here. This the small farmhouse in Appomattox, Virginia. After this, of course, the war is over. Now it'll take a while. It'll take a few weeks for all of the Confederate forces to surrender or to disperse and go home. And of course, the fighting at Richmond is not the last fight. There's still some skirmishing out in other places on the frontier. So it'll take a while for all the fighting to stop. But Lee's surrender in April 9th of 65 marks the official end of the Civil War. Of course, here we are in the weeks after that surrender. Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, Victory Parade. Troops marching down the street in a parade signaling the end of the Civil War. And we can finally we can get back to life as normal, building some sort of a rebuilding America, getting back to life as normal. And of course, in the distance here, just a little piece of trivia for you. They finally finished the distinctive dome on the nation's capital. You can see it here at the end of Pennsylvania Avenue. So this marks the beginning of an end of one era, the beginning of a new era, and the end of the Civil War. Marks the beginning of the next chapter in American history, beginning with Reconstruction, the aftermath of the Civil War, rebuilding the nation after this destructive conflict. And that's going to be a whole big process. That's actually a part 2 of U.S. history topic, but that process begins almost immediately after the Civil War is over, when both sides begin to take inventory of their losses. This cause of the Civil War and the many factors that played into it, slavery and states' rights and state power versus federal power and so on and so forth, and all these issues that have kind of boiled up into this Civil War. Not all of those issues are going to be resolved even with the war. And as we see, if you take part 2 of U.S. history and you see what takes place during Reconstruction, you're going to see a lot of the issues that characterize that period of Reconstruction are the same issues that led to the Civil War. So not only could those issues be unresolved through political process, normal political process, even the Civil War did not bring an end to some of those issues. The one thing it did do is that, of course, in terms of our losses here, and I guess I should address that first. 640,000 Americans were killed during the Civil War. Now, that's on both sides. That's a combination of U.S. soldiers and Confederate soldiers All total combined, over 640,000 Americans were killed during the Civil War. And this is the sad part here. Only 200,000 of those were the result of battlefield casualties. A full 65% of these 65-70% of these casualties were the result of death, or were the result of disease and starvation, especially in the POW camps. You could make a whole career study just what took place in the Civil War POW camps, especially in the South. These camps were beyond nightmarish, particularly in the POW camp at Andersonville in Georgia. This was one of the worst experiences of the war. Most soldiers would prefer death on the battlefield rather than to spend even one day as a POW at Andersonville. A lot of men died in Andersonville from disease and starvation. Prisoners in northern camps weren't treated much better, but again, this is just a sign of the times. Resources and technology were not, and of course, social attitudes toward prisoners were not very compassionate. Society as a whole did not have much sympathy for prisoners, whether they're criminals in jail or soldiers and as prisoners of war. And again, a lot of these deaths will be the result of those situations. But and of course, in the South, a lot of people will die from sickness and hunger, especially in those last months of the war, which are so destructive in those areas. Again, this war is going to have a very high cost. And if you compare the Civil War to all of America's other wars, the number of dead in the Civil War outnumbers the number of dead in every other war combined, from the Revolutionary War all the way up through Vietnam. If you add up all the Americans who were killed in all those wars, it's still not as much as in the Civil War. So the Civil War is important for that reason, not just because of battlefield statistics, but because of the high cost of this war. America will pay a price for this war that will never be exceeded by any other war. Even all the other wars combined won't be as costly as this war in terms of life lost. For that reason, the scars are going to linger for a long time. For the next 100 years, even though the Civil War is over in about 5 years, it's for the next 100 years, America will suffer the festering wounds of this war in terms of its effect on society. Prior to the war, North and South, the animosity between North and South was issue based. There were the issues of state government versus federal government, the issue of slavery and its morality and its economic impact, and there were actual issues that were at the heart of this animosity between North and South. After the Civil War, it's personal. People, family, there will be no family in America that won't pay the price for this in some way. Everybody has family members who were killed in this war. So everyone is going to pay the price of this war. Everyone is going to suffer the scars of this war. Soldiers who bear the scars of battle, families and towns who bear the scars of loss of relatives and friends, and of course economic scars, political scars. There's going to be a lot of lingering hatred and animosity. People in the North will hate Southerners simply because they're Southerners. People in the South will hate Northerners simply because they are Northerners and what they did to us during the war and what they caused during the war. So a lot of these animosities now become personal. A personal grudge against each side of the country, and it's going to take a long time for that to go away. And even today, 150 years later, 160 years later, we see that some of these scars still kind of itch once in a while. The wounds have healed, but the scars are still there, and every now and then it resurfaces. Some of these old animosities tend to resurface, and we see some evidence of that even today. So it takes a long time for these types of wounds to heal. There's nobody who ever served in the Civil War is alive today. Even the grandchildren of all those Civil War participants are dead today. But some of their anger still lingers. And it's handed down from generation to generation. People, Southerners who are angry at Northerners for the destruction of the South, they tell their kids and their grandkids, and these animosities linger on. The same goes with Northern people who lost family members and friends in this war, all because of the Southerners rebelled against the nation, and all of our guys died trying to stop it. These animosities will linger for many years. So this is going to have long-term ripple effect through American politics and American society and American economics. It'll take the South almost 100 years to finally catch up with the North economically. In terms of politics, a lot of what happens during Reconstruction will permanently ingrain some of the racial aspects of Southern politics and Southern society into that society. And again, if you take part 2 of U.S. history, you'll see how a lot of what goes on in Reconstruction helps to reinforce some of these old animosities. It doesn't fix anything. At any rate, the one really good thing that came out of the Civil War was the end of slavery, and this is a big prize. While this was not the goal of the war initially, for many people it was. For the abolitionists who supported the Civil War, their goal was always the end of slavery. And of course, as Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, he's kind of hinting at his support for this as a war aim to bring about the end of slavery. In fact, Lincoln and the Republicans begin crafting this 13th Amendment during the last few months of the war. Once victory appeared to be imminent, Lincoln felt he had no choice but to support this. While he said in the beginning that he was not setting out to destroy slavery, he was attempting to preserve the Union. By the time he gets to the end of the war and victory is imminent, he realizes that, okay, there's no way I can not address this issue of slavery. So Lincoln puts his full support behind this 13th Amendment, which basically brings about an official end to the institution of slavery. And the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery completely and totally throughout every square inch of American territory. In every state, in every territory throughout the United States, slavery is illegal. And the 13th Amendment makes it very clear that the institution is now dead. So this is a good thing. Of course, as kind of evidence of how these animosities will linger, even though Congress passes the 13th Amendment in January of '65, it's not going to be ratified until December of '65. So Congress passes it before the war is actually over. But it's going to take the rest of that year to get all the states to ratify it. And of course, once we get into Reconstruction, as the southern states start to rejoin the Union, ratification of the 13th Amendment becomes a requirement for readmittance to the Union. All you southern states, you want to rejoin the Union and become full-fledged member of the United States again, you're going to have to ratify this 13th Amendment, which means if you continue to try and have slavery as an institution in your state, you will not be allowed to rejoin the Union. So again, they use a lot of political pressure to bring those southern states in line. Eventually, every southern state will ratify the 13th Amendment, but as a kind of a last little trivial footnote here to illustrate how long some of these animosities of the Civil War will linger, the last 2 states to ratify the 13th Amendment were Kentucky and Mississippi. Kentucky ratified the 13th Amendment in 1976. So more than 100 years after the end of the Civil War, Kentucky finally ratifies the 13th Amendment. And Mississippi was even worse. Mississippi did not ratify the 13th Amendment until 1995. Now, of course, there was no slavery in Mississippi after the Civil War, but a lot of these holdout states, some of them they put off ratification of this amendment just for spite, just to make a point, to make a statement. And of course, for the amendment to be included in the Constitution, it only needed a two-thirds of the states to ratify it. So it became part of the Constitution regardless of whether those last few states ratified it or not. But just kind of to make a point, some of those states they refused to ratify it until years and years later. So the abolishment of slavery does not solve everything. Yes, slavery as a legal institution is dead, but the racial animosities and the segregation and the discrimination will continue on. In fact, in many ways, life in the South for black people was it changed very little after the Civil War. They were technically free, but many of them ended up in situations where they were sharecroppers or tenant farmers, where they were forced to give up a portion of their crop to the landowner whose land that they lived and worked on, and of course a lot of those slave codes that we saw from the pre-Civil War years, a lot of those were retained by Southern states. They just renamed them black codes. In fact, basically all they did was they went to the state laws and they scratched out the word slave and they wrote the word black, but the laws did not change at all. So black people in the South will suffer the same legal restrictions and discrimination that had existed before the war, and that'll linger on for as well into the 20th century. In fact, it won't be it'll be more than 100 years after the Civil War where we see Southern states finally achieving some degree of equality for blacks in the South. And again, this is just an indication that the Civil War did not solve all these problems. It did not resolve all the issues. Most of the issues that led to the Civil War remain after the Civil War, with the exception of slavery, which was abolished by the 13th Amendment. So in the annals of history, in the fight for racial equality, the 13th Amendment was a very important step in that it brought to an official end, the institution of slavery, but it was only a first step in the beginning of a century-long process of achieving some sort of racial equality in America. So that's where the story will begin for part 2 of U.S. history. If you take part 2 of U.S. history, that's where the story begins. So that's all we have for the semester. Again, the Civil War was just kind of the climax of our story, but it's important that you remember it is not the end of the story, but the beginning of the next chapter. And that's it for the semester. Hopefully we'll see you all in part 2 of U.S. history.